Thank you, Father. Let me know if you can hear me in the back. Is this okay? Oh, we're getting a little bit of feedback. It might be you, Father. Okay, very good. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you here, and I suppose you have your schedules and you can see what we're doing. We're, unlike the Greeks, starting on time. Okay? Actually, a couple of minutes early. So we're going to be talking first about women in the church. We'll do this for an hour. I'll try to end a little bit before the hour so we can hear your comments and your questions. And then we're going to be taking a little break after every hour. So we're focusing a lot on the early church, and the Orthodox Church, of course, is the focus of the next 2 days. And because obviously half the population is female, and there are questions about women's leadership and ministry in the church today, it's appropriate to be talking about this. And so I think we're going to begin with this subject. And before we talk about women in the early church and women in the Orthodox Church, we're going to begin by talking about women in Second Temple Judaism. This is the period of time that we're talking about when the church began. And a lot of the concepts and attitudes towards women that were present in Judaism at the time of Christ persist today in the more conservative forms of Judaism, especially we're talking about the Orthodox Jews and even more conservative Hasidic Jews. Women had very little autonomy in the era of the early church in Judaism. They had very restricted lives, you know, unless they were unmarried and unless they were wealthy. If you had money and you weren't tied to a man, which is extremely unusual to be unmarried unless you were a widow, you had a lot of restrictions on your life. So women were under the authority of men almost continually from the moment of their birth to their death. And part of this was financial. You know, we have to remember when we're thinking about the Bible and how people lived, we can't make assumptions based on how people live today. Initially, of course, a woman or girl was under her father's authority. He chose the husband for his daughter. Under biblical law, or we could say under the laws that were the oral traditions at the time and later became codified in the Mishnah, he could choose his daughter's husband between the ages of 12 and 12 and a half. It was 6 months. It was a 6-month window. And then whoever he chose, she had to marry. If she was older than 12 and a half or younger than 12, if you can imagine that, when she was betrothed, she could repudiate the marriage. She could choose for herself. I don't know how often that happened. I would suspect that most of the time the dad chose the husband for her and she went along with it. She didn't really have much of a choice in the matter. Then she's under her husband's authority. And of course she was given a dowry. Now the dowry was a very important thing because it was the only, we could say, protection that she had. It was the only means of support that she had if something should go wrong in the marriage. So if the husband decided to divorce her and he held all the cards, wives could not choose to divorce, only a husband could, he had to return the dowry so she would have something to live on, so she wouldn't be left destitute. But while she was married, the husband controlled the dowry completely. He could invest the money, he controlled it any way he wanted. When they got married, a man and a woman would sign a contract, or even is really the engagement ceremony that is the contract, the promise to marry. And they signed a contract called a ketubah. And today, Jewish couples will proudly have a frame of their ketubah, and they write it very pretty calligraphy and this sort of a thing. But the ketubah was the basis for the marriage. And I just want you to think about how different that is than for the Christian conception of marriage. It was a legal relationship that was created by marriage. And the contract, the ketubah, spelled out everything. It spelled out how often she could get new clothes, that she was allowed to eat or purchase her favorite food, how many times a year she could go and visit her parents. I mean, everything, including what she was obligated to provide financially for the family. And that had to do with the amount of cloth she was required by contract, in the marriage contract, to produce. And this is one of the most important things that women did, and this is how they contributed to the family, by producing cloth. Weaving was a woman's job. They would produce this cloth, and she was obligated by contract to produce a certain amount of cloth. So this is a very different idea of marriage than what we have today. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't any real love between husbands and wives, but it was a very different foundation for the marriage, and the relationship was also extremely regulated by laws of the law of Moses, laws of ritual purity especially. If she became a widow, she was encouraged to remarry. They almost always remarried, sometimes because it was financially necessary. Let's say she became a widow and she, was of a lower class or maybe a middle class. She's not going to go out and get a job. That didn't happen. So she really depended upon a man to provide for her. And so women were really viewed in many respects. Of course, in the law of Moses, there is lots of beautiful language about how wonderful wives are and how important they are, etc. But in terms of the day-to-day life, they were viewed very often in a negative way. They were restricted from having any kind of a public role or any place where they could exercise influence other than the home. Men were rather intimidated, or we could say worried about women, because of women's menstrual cycle. Contact with a woman who was bleeding was considered very, very terrible. This would make a man ritually impure, ritually unclean. And so this is one reason why scholars believe that women's activity outside the home was severely restricted, because men were afraid of women, because they didn't know that they might touch one by accident and then he would become ritually unclean. And when we think about the story of the Lord with the woman who was had the hemorrhage of blood for 12 years, this is what her situation was. She had been ritually unclean for 12 years. She heard about the Lord. She ventured out of her house, and she's in this huge crowd. It was very, very scandalous. She's in this huge crowd of people, and they're all trying to get near Jesus, and they're bumping her. She's making all these men ritually unclean. That's why she was so afraid to approach him. Not just that she was afraid to approach the Lord, but how other people would react to her presence in a crowd, knowing very well that she was contaminating or defiling all of these men. Okay, is this better? Should I take this off?
No.
Okay. Yes, I hope so. You tell me. How's this? Okay. Thank you. So, for a menstruating woman to make a man ritually unclean was considered a violation of the law, and it was actually, in order to make sure that women took this seriously, and by the way, it's not just when they were bleeding, but a certain number of days prior and a certain number of days after. And women were responsible for checking these things and spotting and making sure that they didn't make the men in the house unclean. Now, it was so serious, and this is, I don't know if men really believed this or this is just what they told the women. They told women that if a woman died in childbirth, it was because she had violated this law. She had made a man unclean. And this is so horrific because, of course, this was a great fear. And a lot of women did die in childbirth, and when they died, it was considered her fault. Today, medically, we know there's a lot of reasons why women might die in childbirth, but this is what they were told, that they had defiled a man, and that was God's punishment, if you will, okay? So, difficult deliveries and death in childbirth was very, very common. And so I don't know that it was said intentionally, or maybe this was just what the rabbis surmised. Why do some women die in childbirth and others don't? Oh, these women were careful and they made sure that they followed the law, and these women were not. But it was terrible. But there was clearly a double standard in Judaism. So men saw women as a source of potential ritual pollution. There was a very interesting thing that happened some years ago in the news, maybe like 10 or 15 years ago. I don't know if you remember this, if it made the news here in Australia. But there was a Jewish airliner. It wasn't Air El Al, but it was some other airliner that had a bunch of, their flight was delayed because some Orthodox Jewish men, when they got on the airplane, they had not made, I guess, their own reservations early in advance. So they saw that they were seated by a woman, and they refused to sit down. And the plane can't take off while anybody's standing in the aisle. But they refused to be seated by a woman. And the women were so offended by this, they refused to change their seats. And they were kind of stuck at the boarding gate for a long time, until finally somebody gave in. I don't remember what happened. But that's the kind of thing. They don't want to bump a woman in. I had somebody, it was very interesting. She worked at a hotel that every year would host a convention of Orthodox Jews. And she told me about all the kinds of things that they had to do to accommodate these guests. They had to have separate closets for coats. There was a closet for women's coats, because men didn't want a woman's coat touching their coat. Okay, this is the law of Moses, laws of ritual purity. But beyond this, beyond the fear of men, because you can't tell that a woman is menstruating by looking at her, so they were always afraid of them. That's why they wanted them to keep their distance. Beyond that, there was always a double standard in Judaism, and it still exists today in Orthodox Judaism. Only the husband could get a divorce. And I don't know if you've heard of these stories where there's a couple, and they're an Orthodox couple, and the wife wants a divorce, and the husband will move on with his life, get involved with another woman, and out of spite will not give the wife a divorce. And she can never move on. She can never get remarried. When it comes to custody of children, they always favor the man. Only a man could commit adultery. That's true. How is it possible? Well, because there's this double standard. Only the wife could commit adultery, because a married man, this is Jewish law, thankfully not the Christian understanding, a married man could have relations with another woman as long as she wasn't married to another man. You see? So they could visit prostitutes or have some other woman. This is why they're, concubine or something like this. Only a Jewish man could testify in court. Women were not allowed to testify in court. Only Jewish men counted for the quorum, called a minyan, etc. So, it was a very different kind of attitude that Jewish men had toward women, and there were different standards and different privileges and different requirements. Now, what men would say is that women were exempt from many of the requirements of the law, and that was true primarily because they were the ones who were responsible for raising children and taking care of the home. So, for example, if you're expected to be at the synagogue on Saturday, and you've had a baby or you've got a lot of young children, you were exempt from that requirement. But what happened was women were given exemptions from these things, regardless of their stage in life or their situation. And then over time, the rabbis interpreted the exemption as an exclusion. Not that women were exempt from saying these prayers, but they were forbidden from saying the prayers. It became an exclusion. They were not allowed to offer sacrifices. They were not allowed to say certain prayers. They were not allowed to do these things. They were forbidden from doing them. And so that just narrows the scope of activity in the public sphere and in the religious sphere. So women really were very much confined to the home. And they were considered a source of scandal. What I thought was kind of funny when I was doing this research is that they were considered to be inherently less moral than men. Okay, because we would think that women are usually more in charge of their urges than men. We think of men as being more likely to give into these kinds of temptations than women. But it was the opposite in the Jewish mind, that given the opportunity to do so, a woman would be immoral. She would commit adultery or something like this. So they said that women were a source of temptation, and so they would actually say that a man, like 100 men could be trusted to be with one woman, but 2 women could not be trusted to be with one man, because they were going to, because they were inclined toward immorality. So rabbis were also taught their disciples not to speak excessively with a woman, lest this lead you to adultery. And so they deliberately did not speak to women in public. This is why, especially if they were alone, this is why when Jesus goes and stops at the well, at Jacob's well, and he strikes up this conversation with the woman, and the disciples come back and find him talking to her, they're like, why is he talking to her? And he of course says, go call your husband, and we learn about her life, etc. So rabbis advised men not even to speak to their wives in public. They could speak to a little daughter, but when she got older, like marriageable age, they would not speak to their daughters in public. This was the attitude. And so here's what it says in, I think it says in Mishnah. Our rabbis taught 6 things are a cause of reproach to a disciple of the sages. He shall not converse with a woman in the market. That's one of the big things they were not supposed to do. And this is why we have not found that the Almighty spoke to a woman except to Sarah. Isn't that amazing? So in all the Bible, God doesn't talk to women. So we're not going to talk to women either, okay? So girls were also not educated unless they were wealthy. And teaching a woman the Torah, this is now, how this word is interpreted, people argue about this, but sometimes they say the Torah, the Talmud says, to teach a woman the Torah is to pervert it. In other words, women should not be taught the Torah. And so what does this mean? Rabbis had no female disciples. With all this happening, of course they're not going to have a female disciple except for Christ. And this is why I'm giving you this background, so that we can have an appreciation for what Christ did for women. Because today people say, oh, the church oppressed women, the church is evil, and this sort of a thing. Are you kidding me? The church was the great liberator of women. In the church, women were equal to men. This was unheard of in Judaism, and also people were equal regardless of their social status, regardless of their economic status in the early church. This was unheard of in the Roman Empire. So we have to remember what Christ did for women and what the Roman Empire did for what the church did for men and women of all kinds. So no rabbis had female disciples except for Jesus. And we know the names of a few of them. Of course, Mary Magdalene, whose feast day we just celebrated, was the most famous. But there were others, and they're mentioned: Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, Salome, Joanna, Susanna, and there were definitely many others. And here's what was so unique about them. They traveled with the Lord and the disciples. And the only one who talks about this, it's just a precious gift to the church, is St. Luke in his gospel. And if you want to know where to find that, it is in Luke at the very beginning of chapter 8. It talks about how the Lord traveled all around Galilee. he was accompanied by the 12 and many women who were with him, and the names Mary Magdalene, from whom he cast out 7 demons, and Joanna and Susanna. Oh, I love Joanna, and her feast day is also coming up here in July. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's chief steward. And I love this woman whom we know practically nothing about, but I love it because she's married. We don't know about the others. Some of them must have been married, perhaps some were widows, but she's definitely married to a very high-ranking person. He's running the head of Herod's household. He's running Herod's household. That would have been Herod Antipas in Galilee, the king of Galilee, or, a tetrarch of Galilee. And she's running around Galilee following Jesus. And it's just remarkable. It says a lot about Chusa too, that he doesn't mind that his wife is traveling around the countryside with Jesus and these other men and women. It's so remarkable. It's so unusual. But of course, it shows us that the Lord was not concerned with issues of ritual purity. So how do we know that they were disciples? And people say, well, maybe he just kept them around to cook, or wash their clothes or something like this. That's not true, because in the famous story of Mary and Martha, Mary's sitting down and Martha's listening to the Lord talk, and Martha's getting upset and annoyed because she needs help in the kitchen, and her sister's just sitting down listening to Jesus, and she asks the Lord, finally she's exasperated, Lord, tell my sister to help me. And he says that Mary has chosen the better part. Well, the description of Mary there, sitting at the feet of Jesus, is a classic description of any disciple. The teacher always sat on a chair or a bench, and the disciples sat on the floor at his feet. So this is how we know that she was considered a disciple. And the Lord praised the fact that she wanted to learn. And, says we're troubled and anxious. Martha, Martha, you're troubled and anxious about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary has chosen the better part. So he gives his approval explicitly of female disciples. So the Lord did not have any double standard for men and women. The teachings of Christ applied equally to men and women. The moral teachings and everything that he expects from us. And we see this in the early church also. There was no suggestion that men could achieve holiness, but women could not. Or the path to holiness is different for men than it is for women. And in the church, of course, as soon as the church begins, the Holy Spirit on Pentecost comes upon everybody who's present, about 120 people, and among them were a number of women. Of course, they don't get it. The women didn't get some different gifts of the Holy Spirit than the men. And so we know that there were female apostles like Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary and Martha and Junia, who is known to us from the epistle to the Romans. She's not mentioned in the Gospels, but there were female apostles. So what do we mean by apostle? Let's talk about that momentarily. Today, when we use the term apostle, we mean one of the 12. We use that as synonymous with the 12 and Paul. It's the 12 plus Paul. Now, in the early church, the term apostle was used much more widely. The term apostle meant anyone who had seen the Lord alive again after the crucifixion. In other words, an apostle was an eyewitness to the resurrection. The reason why that was so important is because that is the message of the church, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so they sent out apostles who would be witnesses. So people wouldn't say, well, I heard, or somebody said that Jesus rose from the dead. Instead, the apostles said, I was there. I know that he died on the cross. He was buried, and we saw him alive again. And I'm an eyewitness to that. And if you read the book of Acts, you'll see again and again and again that people like St. Peter and others will say, we are witnesses to this. So women also witnessed to the resurrection, not just Mary Magdalene, but all of the disciples of Christ, all the people who were followers of Jesus Christ, they saw him alive again. There were many, many appearances that he had, not just the few that are in the Gospels. Paul relates others in which there was, in one instance, the Lord appeared alive again after the resurrection to 500 people at one time. And there are certainly women in there. So we have to recognize that women were also apostles according to the standards of the early church. Now today, to distinguish them from the 12, we use the term for people like Mary Magdalene, is apostolos, equal to the apostles. I wish they just let her be called an apostle. That would be more consistent with the terminology of the early church, but now that term is kind of just belongs to the 12. But you should know that they were regarded as apostles. So there were apostles, which means that they were preachers, and certainly Mary Magdalene did this, as did all the other women. I mean, Lazarus went to Cyprus, and his sisters were with him. Mary and Martha were with him. And he didn't just do all the preaching, they were also preaching. There were evangelists. There was Saint Fautini, the woman at the well. Of course, there were others, like as I mentioned, and teachers like Priscilla, who taught Aquila. I mean, Priscilla, who was the wife of Aquila, who taught Apollos. There were prophets like the daughters of Philip, the deacon. There were healers like Hermione, who was one of Philip's daughters. There were deacons like Phoebe. So women performed a lot of functions in the early church, and this was very, very revolutionary. And whatever leadership women had in the early church, a lot of it had to do with charisms. Women prophesied, they spoke in tongues, they did everything that men did, and there was no distinction between them. So, you know, sometimes people say, well, what about all these things that St. Paul says? And what about his... Sometimes people are confused by St. Paul's words. Paul says in a couple of places, in Christ there is neither male nor female, nor slave nor free, nor Jew nor Greek. He says this in a couple of different places. So if that's the case, why don't we have women priests? If in Christ there's neither male nor female, etc. And that they get confused because later Paul will say, or elsewhere Paul will say, let the women be silent in the churches. And this is the thing that's thrown in our faces all the time, okay? So how do we reconcile that? Well, the first thing you have to understand is that when St. Paul says that there is neither male nor female, nor Jew, nor Gentile, nor slave, nor free, he's speaking there, especially in Galatians, he says, all those who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Therefore, there is neither male nor female, nor slave, nor free, nor Jew, nor Greek. We are one in Christ. Everybody is equal in the church. This is what he's saying. So when we are baptized, we become little Christ. We put on Christ, like you're putting on your coat. You are being robed in Christ. You're clothed in a baptismal garment. You become like Christ. And there's no distinction. Now that you understand what I explained to you about Judaism, in the church, there's no different rules for men and women. There isn't Judaism. Only women can do the Shabbos prayers. You know, you've seen them with the candles. They light the candles. They go like this, and they cover their face, and they say the Sabbath prayers. This is only for women, and believe it or not, it's considered a punishment. It's a reminder of the sin of Eve. Think about that. There are very, very few things that are only women are allowed to do, and they're negative. There's a negative connotation in Judaism about it at its core. I don't think they think of it. When I say it, I think it's really beautiful. She's saying her prayers. But the way the rabbis explain it, it's not a positive thing, it's a negative thing. So in the church, we don't have that. There's no rules for fasting for women versus men. There's no special grace for men versus grace for women. There's no way to achieve holiness or sanctification that's different from men and for women. Women are not exempt from certain things, except for, on a very limited basis when it comes to, having children. You're not expected to be at church the next Sunday or something like that. But other than that, the church, women and men are equal in the church. And that means that the role of lay men is exactly the same as lay women. The only distinction is for men who have been ordained. So there's a different role for the priest, a different role for the bishop, and a different role for deacons, but most men in the church are not ordained. That means that whatever a lay man can do, a lay woman can also do. And so we need to kind of get over this idea that, women can't go in the altar, women can't chant, women can't do this, women can't do that. It's actually not true. Whatever happens in the church can be done by women with the permission, of course, of the parish priest and the bishop. And so there's this kind of idea, because we're used to seeing men in leadership positions, that those things women are excluded from those things. But that's actually not true. There's no impediment to women becoming involved in virtually everything having to do with the life of the church. I'm going to answer with the other parts of what St. Paul says in a minute. So it's important for us to recognize this, because we get these ideas, and many of you perhaps were not raised in the church, but I know that we were told women can't go into the altar, and actually that's not true. They can go if they have the permission of the bishop. By the way, men can't go in the altar either, unless they have the permission of the bishop. So there's this idea, because we're accustomed to seeing men serving in the altar, that any man can go in and all women have to stay out. But actually that is not true. No one can enter. Even Father doesn't enter there unless he has the permission of the bishop, who can withdraw that, by the way. Okay? The Father can't say, hey, I'm a priest, no matter what you say, bishop, I'm going to go in there and serve. He serves only with the permission of the bishop. Men do not have carte blanche to enter. You should be fearful. You should be afraid to set foot in the altar. You shouldn't stroll into the altar, I'm a man, I can enter the altar. Because men get this idea that there's something special just because they're male. That's not true. So I'm telling you this because of course, you've probably been to female monasteries, or maybe you know that nuns enter the altar. People always say, oh, but they're nuns. They're pure and they're holy. Well, you know what? Our very first parish in California, there was a lady who served in the altar and assisted the priest during the Divine Liturgy on weekday services, because very often there were no acolytes to assist the priest. She had the permission of the bishop. She was behind the icon screen. I've seen that before elsewhere. There was a woman in San Diego who had the permission of the bishop. She likewise assisted the priest during the weekday divine services. In Canada, which is pretty conservative, by the way, very Greeky, the Metropolitan of Toronto, now recently retired, Metropolitan Sotirios, had a woman who also served in his chapel at the metropolis behind the icon screen during the services, getting the hot water ready for communion, and all the things that an acolyte normally does. So get out of your mind this idea that women cannot do those things. So in what circumstances can they serve? We have to show that we are worthy of this. Okay, but the attitude of, I should be allowed in even though I'm a woman, and this kind of an attitude of entitlement is not appropriate. Okay? But if a woman really wishes to serve the church, no matter what it is, there's nothing to prevent her from serving the church except in an ordained capacity. This is something that's not open to us, but that's okay. And that's the decision of the Lord. That's not for us to question. So what about all these things of St. Paul's comments? A woman must be silent. Women must be silent in the churches. Well, that's one way that men just like to shut us up. I rest my case on St. John Chrysostom, who said that when St. Paul said that women must be silent, he's talking about them carrying on conversations in the church. Now, the fact is that we tend to be much more chatty than men. We just are. We're normally more conversant. Men will enter the church and like they'll see a buddy and they'll nod at each other. Women will like, oh, how are you? I haven't seen you for so long. Oh, I love your dress. Where did you get it? Oh, it was on sale. That's what we do. We tend to be chatty. And that hasn't changed. In the time of Chrysostom, he said, if you want to learn anything, don't go to the marketplace, come to the church. Here you're going to find out all the gossip. You're going to learn everything there is to know. Because people, especially women, were talking in church. That's what he says. Now, this is not just an interpretation that he plucked out of thin air. His interpretation is based on the context. What is the context? Because where Paul says let the women be silent in churches. This is in 1 Corinthians, earlier in that same book, he says, when a woman prophesies in church, let her cover her head. Well, obviously there's no such thing as a silent prophecy. Let me just emit ideas to you, telepathically give you my prophecy. That's stupid. So women were speaking in church. Women were speaking in tongues in church. Women were interpreting tongues in church. So they were speaking in church. And then, right after he says, let the women be silent in the churches, St. Paul says, if she desires to learn anything, let her ask her husband at home. That means there was a conversation. So let's say the presbyter was preaching, and she says to her husband, I didn't understand. What did he say? And then the husband has to stop and explain it to her. So we didn't want any side conversations. You know how dinner parties always devolve from one conversation to all these little conversations? So that's not appropriate. We're not supposed to be having conversations in church. And this was Chrysostom's interpretation based on the context of the book itself and also St. Paul's life, in which St. Paul had women disciples and women helpers like Priscilla and others. So that's his interpretation. So anybody who just says, well, it says here, women have to be silent, and how do people interpret that? Well, you know how in many Protestant circles, women are not allowed to say or do anything. And I've been told by women who have become Orthodox that in the church that they came from, they were not allowed only to teach other women or children. If any male entered the room, even a boy, they had to give over the teaching to the boy. So there are some Protestant sects, and they're very proud of themselves. We take the Bible literally. Here it says women have to be silent, and don't allow a woman to teach or have authority over men. That's a different passage. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That's not what the early church was like. That's what makes Orthodoxy different. We just don't read this one verse and arrive at some conclusion. We look at the entire context. It can't mean the women can never speak in church, because women did speak in church. And I'm speaking in church right now. So not during this service, of course, but I do preach. I've been invited to preach. I've preached many times in the church. And why is that? So women can preach, even in the church. The Russians tend to be a little bit more restrictive about that, but the Antiochians and the Greeks, they're much more, I hate to say this, like the early church. In the Roman Catholic tradition, women can never preach in church, but any priest or even a deacon can preach in the church. Now, a woman can have 100 theological degrees in the Roman Catholic Church. She is not allowed to preach in church. A man who is a priest can know nothing because I've had students who were already ordained in places like Vietnam, in South America, other places. They came to the Franciscan School of Theology to be educated. They were already a priest. They were already preaching, and they had no theological education. Why is that? So can you see how that makes no sense? And that the Orthodox Church looks at whether or not a person is qualified to preach. And what else allows a woman to preach in church? Not only that she has an Orthodox theological degree, but she has the permission of the bishop. So I preach because I have the permission of my bishop, and if I have the permission of the local bishop, and the priest asks me to preach, I will preach in church. But not in the Roman Catholic Church, because they consider preaching a priestly function. They don't look at the qualifications of the person. Now, conversely, do you know that many priests in Greece and Cyprus have no theological education? They go to school for a couple of years, they learn the divine services, they learn how to chant and these things, but they don't learn theology. Those priests cannot preach in the church. Did you know that? They can't preach. Instead, if there's a parish that has a priest who does not have a theological education, in other words, they go to what is effectively a trade school. They learn the mechanics of the services, but they can't explain the faith. So in those churches, there is a daily, or like a weekly sermon that's published by the bishop, and the chanter reads it. I saw this in Cyprus. So when my husband went to Cyprus and he served at the church there for a few months, we met the bishop, and he says, yes, of course you have to preach. You're a theologian. He didn't say you preach because you're a priest. Being a priest doesn't qualify you to preach in the Orthodox Church, believe it or not. That's the truth. So preaching for the Orthodox is not a priestly function, it's a teaching function. And women can teach. Women can lead Bible studies, women can chant, women can do everything. So what about this little passage, this other one that people love to point out to us to keep us quiet? St. Paul writes elsewhere, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over men. Oh, that will show you got to shut up, woman. Shut up, woman. You have no authority over men. Now, I'm going to rely on Chrysostom for this too. This is what he says. And I was so happy because I was looking at this verse and I was thinking, and I looked at the word for authority. The word for authority, the ordinary word for authority in Greek is exousia, E-X-O-U-S-I-A, exousia. So when Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, that's the word exousia. But there's another word that has no English counterpart that is usually translated in that place as authority. The word is authentia, A-U-T-H-E-N-T-I-A, authentia. Authentia, or we don't pronounce a hard T. Authentia. There's no English word for that. It means the authority of somebody who has supreme authority. That word is used for bishops and the emperor. So when St. Paul says, I do not permit a woman to have authentia over men, he means they cannot be bishops. And it's appropriate that he's writing that to Timothy when he's explaining to Timothy about how he's going to choose people to serve in leadership positions in the church. Women will never be bishops. They'll never exercise that level of authority. And that's what Chrysostom says. I have to tell you, I was happy to find that Chrysostom talks about that word and says this means that a woman is not allowed to preach from the vima. That's the place of the bishop. Okay? So a woman cannot exercise that level of authority in the church. Doesn't mean she can't ever teach a man. And then Chrysostom talks about other women who were teaching men, like Priscilla, who taught Apollos, and she's mentioned in the book of Acts. But we have so many other women that we know were teaching. Gregory the theologian, his mother taught his father. His father became a bishop of the church. He's called Gregory the Elder. Gregory the theologian's father was a pagan, and his mother catechized him. Then he became ordained, and he became a bishop of the church, and then Gregory the theologian later became a bishop of the church. He was taught by a woman. So this is something we have to get out of these kind of narrow-minded ideas that women are not allowed to do these things. So why is it that we haven't seen women preachers and women, so as many women chanters and things like this? Well, this is for a very simple reason. Because we simply didn't have the opportunity. In the early church, a lot of women just gave up their lives to follow Christ. They didn't get married. They didn't settle down. They were just traveled all over. They were healers, and they were preachers, and they were teachers, companions and helpers of St. Paul. But after the church kind of settled down, and men naturally assumed these leadership roles, it was easier for men to assume leadership roles because women were having to stay home and be with children, babies and children. So this doesn't mean that these things were forbidden to women. It's just that they weren't visibly seen. And especially since after the time when there were no longer any women deacons, we just tend to see men occupying those positions, and then we assume that they're closed to women. And for practical purposes, they kind of were. Just think about what life was like not that long ago, even 100 years ago. Even 100 years ago, many homes, whether in the United States or here in Australia, they didn't have electricity. Women, somebody had to stay home, and of course, even before that, somebody had to stay home, keep the fire going, make dinner, make the clothes, grow the vegetables, raise the animals. Somebody had to be home doing that so the man could go out and work, to be a fisherman or to work in the fields or to be the parish priest or whatever it was. You couldn't survive without a woman being at home doing these things. So what was she going to do? Go study theology and become a preacher? It wasn't going to happen. So until modern times gave us the ability to be educated and to have the freedom from not having to be at home all the time, this is why now we see more women in these leadership positions. And we shouldn't feel uncomfortable about it. We should really see that we're kind of returning more to what we saw, a more active role of women in the church in the early church. So one of the questions here on your program was, is the Orthodox Church patriarchal? And I would say no, unless you want to say it's patriarchal because only men can be ordained. I don't consider that patriarchal because women can do virtually everything else that all lay men can do. Most of the men in the church are not ordained. We're not Mormons. The Mormons, every man over the age of 12 is a priest. We're not Mormons. So most men are in exactly the same position as women. So laymen can preach, and laymen can teach, and laymen can have leadership positions of all kinds in the church, and they can serve as acolytes and that sort of a thing. So women, there's no such thing as, I don't believe that Orthodoxy is patriarchal. And then the other question is, does it ascribe to strict gender roles? No, it does not. But here again, as we have people coming into the church from a Protestant background, we're seeing people, I could say, projecting onto the Orthodox Church ideas about marriage that are not Orthodox. And they come from this Protestant idea, which are always arguing about what is a relationship between husband and wife? Is it complementarian? They have all these terms I've never heard of before. I don't know, you probably know them. So they're trying to say, well, the man has this role and the wife has this role, and he's always the head, he's always in charge, she has to be submissive. So in some Orthodox parishes, we're seeing this assumption that because Orthodoxy is traditional, they have to have these roles in which there's an emphasis on the submissiveness of the wife. Now, does it say in the scriptures that the husband is the head of the house, as Christ is the head of the church? Yes, it does. But what does that mean in practicality? How do we see that expressed in the marriage ceremony, in the wedding ceremony? What we see in the reality and in the marriage ceremony is a mutuality that does not require adherence to strict gender roles. As if somehow you're not a good Orthodox wife or an Orthodox husband. You're not a good Orthodox husband unless you're asserting your domination, your leadership in the house. You're not a good Orthodox wife unless you're always submissive to your husband. and saying, yes, I'm going to be submissive to you. Somebody was pointing this out about the Left Behind. I've never seen those books or movies or the books, but some of you may have. How the women are, they make sure that the women express their submissiveness. You know, yes, I'm going to be submissive to you, but I want to just give you my opinion and da-da-da-da-da. You're not going to hear a Greek wife say that, you know, that's for sure. And the Greeks say the husband is the head and the wife is the neck that turns the head. So why is it the head that just doesn't sit on the body? The neck isn't, that's kind of a joke, but there's a lot of truth to that. She's supporting the head, but she has a lot to do about which direction it goes. In the marriage ceremony, we are crowned. We are, and the crowns look identical. This is not like the Russians. In the Greeks, you can't tell the husband's crown from the wife's crown. They look identical. That's very important. And then they're exchanged like this. The wife's crown is put on the head of the husband. His crown is put on the head of her. And it goes like this because that's how marriage works. Anybody who's had a good marriage knows that. There are times when the husband picks up the slack because the wife can't do it. He does her work. There are times when she steps in and does something that he normally would do. There's this kind of fluidity of mutual love and respect and sharing. It's not about strict gender roles because Christ said, and through the words of St. Paul, there's neither male nor female, and that really works very much, for the most part, in our marriages as well. So we have to be very careful not to assume that because Orthodoxy is traditional, we have to fit into these rigid gender stereotypes. Because that is, you know, that's not how real marriages work, at least in my experience, and I've been married 47 years. So, you know, a good marriage has that kind of give and take. That's natural. A couple respects each other. So, you know, Father Costa would, if he were here, he'd be telling you how much he suffered from me. He would tell you how much money he spent to educate me, how many meals he missed because I was studying and writing papers. And yes, he deserves a lot of credit. But there was something else that I want to tell you about him that's very important. I never imagined this life. I was never little and thinking, I'm going to grow up and give talks about the church or Jesus. I never thought about this. And I was helping Father. I majored in my area of concentration, and the university was religious studies. I took a lot of scripture classes. So I was doing the Bible studies at the church, and I was helping with retreats and things like this. So I was helping him. And at one point, after about 10 years of marriage, we moved to Boston so Father could finish his PhD. When we met, he was working on his PhD. He never finished the dissertation. Then he regretted that and said, I really want to finish my dissertation. So I said, okay, let's go. We need to go where there were libraries, good theological libraries like Harvard and Boston University and Boston College. So we moved. And he sat and worked on his dissertation, and he would write all day. And I was taking care of, Christopher was 1 year old. I was taking care of the baby. And then I'd hand the baby over to him, and I would type all night what he had written all day. And it was in Greek, by the way. And it was not easy because he was doing handwriting in Greek and really fast, you know. Anyhow, that's what we did. But almost immediately when we arrived in Boston, he said, I want you to get your PhD. And I said, I got a baby. And I was hoping to have a couple more. And I was imagining myself, because I come from Southern California where we don't have snow, except in the mountains. Most of us don't. We see snow falling, and it's like, wow, snow. And so I imagined myself staying home and making stews and sewing quilts and, you know, being the little homemaker. He says, you have to go back to school. You have to get your PhD. And I'm like, what for? I mean, why? And he said, you have talent, and I don't want to see you waste it. That was really extraordinary. I never forgot that because he knew that me going to school is going to cost the family money. It's a lot of stress on the family. there's a lot more, time away from him. He, obviously didn't get the attention that he normally would, this kind of a thing. But for him to say that means he wanted me to reach my full potential. And he was willing to make that sacrifice. Like I was willing to leave California, where our family was, to move to Boston so he could finish his PhD, so that he would not feel that he had missed out on something that he was meant to do. So this is what you do in a marriage. And so I want you to understand that it's really important that we encourage our girls as much as our boys to be involved in the life of the church and to develop their talents, because we all have something to contribute to the church, both men and women. We're all given special gifts, special graces, and this is what we're supposed to do with it. We're supposed to serve Christ with our talents. That's why that parable is called the parable of the talents. So I forgot the time I was supposed to stop, which is in about 10 minutes. So I was going to talk a little bit about the Theotokos, but I'm going to leave that because I want to open the floor up to questions and comments. Okay, so I'm willing to take anything you have to throw at me. Yes, go ahead. I'll repeat the question. Go ahead. Just speak nice and loud.
The question is, and I'll be careful how to say this. From my understanding, in many Orthodox churches, we have the parish council.
Yes.
And we have the theologically.
Mm-hmm.
Most parish councils in Orthodox churches in Australia, I'm not sure what the situation is in America, are comprised of only males.
Yeah.
And the theological, the ladies' theology is comprised of
Females, yeah.
Based on what we've said in the last 1 hour, is it abnormal that women are not joining the parish council
Yeah.
so they can use their gifts and
Yes.
for the benefit of the church? Is that changing in America? I can't see anything happening in Australia. Please, if I'm mistaken,
That's okay. No, please, no judgment. Ask whatever question you want. You don't have to filter your questions from me. Okay, the question here was, here in Australia, the parish councils are entirely men and the Theotokos is entirely women. Now, what's the situation in America? When I was growing up, that's how it was. Men were on the parish council. Then women started running. And, now we have a lot of parish councils in which the woman is the president of the parish, president of the parish council. Women are very active on the parish councils. Men have not joined Theotokos because that's a women's organization of the church. However, we do encourage men to be auxiliary members, which means that they can support Theotokos, and they should. But men really don't want to belong to Theotokos because we have to remember that we think of Theotokos, which, if you don't know, that's the women's organization. It means Friends of the Poor. We think of them as the women who make the coffee and the sweets for the festivals, but really their role in the church, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's very important, they are the philanthropic arm of the church. I'm assuming that what you have here is what we have in America, in which women of the Theotokos do a lot of fundraising. They give money to a lot of different organizations, national ones like for cancer, and also local ones for local women's shelters and other shelters for the homeless, all kinds of things. This is where the church exercises its philanthropic responsibility through Theotokos. So if you feel like, gee, I'd like to go help at a soup kitchen or homeless people or read to children or whatever it is, and you don't have the time, give money to Theotokos because that is what they do. They're there for that purpose. And it's a very important ministry. So it's not just about pouring tea. I was about to say coffee, but you guys are into your tea. Your teas and cookies and things like this. It is the philanthropy of the church. It's so important. So thanks for that. Very important. Yes, over here.
Yep. Thank you, Dr. Jeannie, for coming and sharing your. Thank you, Dr. Jeannie, for coming and sharing your
My
insights
pleasure.
here with us. I wanted to ask about an idea which I've heard seems to be quite prevalent in contemporary critical liberal scholarship, which is the idea that there seems to be a discrepancy between some of Paul's passages about women and other passages precisely because the ones that tend to be or seem to be less inclusive weren't actually written by Paul. They were written by a later author who was just attributing his work to Paul. So how best would we engage with an idea like that?
Well, that's because they can't understand it from the perspective that I gave you. In other words, Paul had women assistants and helpers, and when he says in Christ there's neither male nor female, he's not talking about ordination, he's comparing it to Judaism. In the church, we're all equal. That's what he's saying. But they can't understand that dichotomy. I just explained why Paul says women must be silent in the churches. They read just that little part and assume, somebody else must have written that. But I just explained to you that it's meant in the most ordinary sense. They're not supposed to talk in church. You see what I mean? So they just presume, they have to find some other way to explain it. So they say somebody else must have written that and inserted that in to keep women silent. But it doesn't make sense because we know that Paul had a lot of women helpers and women were active in the church and they spoke in church. So yeah, that's just an excuse because they don't know how to reconcile those things because they're not reading Chrysostom, you see? Yeah, among other things. By the way, there was this Russian priest. I was talking about women in the church in one of my podcasts, and this Russian priest, Father Dmitry, is so funny. He said, the women run our parishes. There's a lot of truth to that. He said, during communism, it was the women who were doing all the baptisms of babies. Those little old babushkas, get the baby, go into the church, fill up the baptismal font. They were doing the baptisms. And he says the women are running this church, he says so much that the only way I can get away from them is to go to the altar. That's what he says. That's Father Dmitry. Go ahead.
Thank you for your really eye-opening talk. I'm a new mum. I've got an 18-month-old daughter. And
congratulations.
Thank you. I'm grappling with how I'm going to raise her in the church. And I come from a sort of academic background, so I think maybe she will too, maybe. How do I raise her with that sort of confidence that you've spoken about being equal in the church when she's not necessarily seeing that as she grows up in the church because it's not happening as much?
We need to, that's why I told you what Father Costa said to me. We need to encourage our girls to use their gifts for Christ's service just as much as we encourage the boys. They're not going to be deacons, they're not going to be priests, but there's plenty to be done in the church. I think things will change for you here. Why aren't women running for parish council? You tell me. They are? They're starting to? They are starting to? Yeah. So go ahead.
The presupposition of the question of what's happening
in the Antiochians, yeah. Women are very active. Okay. So I would not surprise if that's the case in the Greek parishes, but all it takes is for the women to start running.
We've got our 20th anniversary dinner coming up in a couple of weeks, and we were looking back at the records, and 10 years ago there was a female president of the parish council. So the Good Shepherd.
So the church, that's your tradition here. The Greeks tend to be a little bit more, backwards in these ways and more conservative, but just run. I don't think we live in the era anymore where the men in a Greek Orthodox parish would say, how dare she run for parish council? She's got no place in the parish council. It just takes women to start getting involved, and those things will change. Yeah, thanks. But notice that there's a difference, and I don't know if it has to do with the fact that this is a more multi-ethnic parish, and the Greek parishes tend to be a bit more traditional. Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much. I was wondering if anybody could point to a point in history where women were ordained as ministers, and what about deaconesses?
Yes, women were deaconesses in the early church. They have never been priests. There have been people or presbyters. There have been people who argue that women were presbyters, and they'll point to different writings or sometimes paintings on walls of places. Oh, this was a woman presbyter or women priest. There were women priests in the early church, but they were part of heretical groups. We got plenty of those. But within the canonical church, within the Orthodox Catholic Church, we never had female priests. And I can't say why that is the case, but Jesus knows. And we let him make the decisions, and we just abide by that. I have suspicions about that. And my feeling is, and I don't know, this is just purely speculation, which is never a good thing to do, but having been married to a priest, you have to understand that the priesthood is not a Sunday morning thing. It's a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week thing. Women could not get away. Let's say a woman was a priest in the early church, and she had a baby. Well, there was no formula in those days. You had to be home to breastfeed. You had children that depended on you. If the woman was the priest and she had to be absent from the home a lot, there would be a huge hole in the home. What would happen to the family? I think it was for practical reasons. The Lord knew that it was better for women not to be priests because that would destroy the family. Now, in the case of the Roman Catholics, they say, yeah, but our priests are celibate. But that's not natural. To require all men, all priests to be celibate is not natural. So for them, if they want to have women priests and they're celibate and they don't have a family. But I'm telling you, I cannot tell you how many times Father got calls in the middle of the night to go to the hospital. And that's in America. In Africa, very often, there's just one priest that serves several parishes in different communities, in different villages, and they don't even have cars. They walk from village to village, and they're gone for a month. In these, so I don't know if you know about IOCC and these other Orthodox charities, OCMC, the mission charity. We need to support these because this is the reality. So we kind of look at it from our perspective. We have telephones, we have cars. Why can't a woman do this job? But that's not the reality of antiquity, and that's not the reality for most priests who are serving the church around the world. So no, we never had female priests. I think that's Christ's wisdom because he wanted to preserve the family. And frankly, I think that makes sense to me. And I'll tell you another reason, even though you didn't ask. When I was a Harvard student, I took some classes we had a consortium. You could take classes at any one of several theological schools if you're a graduate student. Near Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a divinity school called Episcopal Divinity School. And I wasn't taking classes there, but I was taking classes at another school that was being housed by them, which was a Catholic school, Weston Jesuit School of Theology. So I was on the campus of the divinity school. Here's what happened to the Anglican Church once they started ordaining women. Men aren't going to the priesthood. That's a fact. And that's, by the way, the case with Lutherans also. Very few men are entering the priesthood. It's become a woman thing. We have a tendency to take over. That's what we do. So if we were in there too, there wouldn't be room for the men. Now, I think that there's a real psychology behind this. And so Christ knew what he was doing. We don't have to have a reason for it. We just know that we obey him, and this is what the church has done. Now, why don't we have women deacons? So there's some discussion about this today. Women deacons were primarily doing a ministry to women and children. So if they needed somebody to take communion to a woman who's sick at home, couldn't leave, the deaconess would do this. It was considered inappropriate for a male deacon to go to a woman's bedroom, let's say she's sick in bed, and give her communion. So the deaconess did that. Now, the other thing that was very important for the deacon, a female deacon, is that she was the one who baptized women, because almost all baptisms were of adults, and they were baptized naked. So you couldn't have a male deacon baptizing a naked adult female. So that was one of the main things that they did. So because we rarely have, now we have more and more adult baptisms, but we're not baptizing people naked, right? So there's just, that kind of fell out of favor because it was no longer in use. Now, you can make the argument that we need women deacons, and I can see it in a certain way. That my husband had a big parish, a big Greek parish of 800 families. He visited 100 shut-ins every month to give them communion. That's a lot of people. If we had a woman deacon who could administer communion or go to a hospital visit or something, I could see how that could be helpful to the clergy. We do have women chaplains, by the way. I didn't mention that. We have women hospital chaplains who are Orthodox. We have women who are doing prison ministry in America. And we could use a woman who is a deacon to go give communion to an Orthodox woman in prison. So there's a need for it. But here's what happened. There was a kind of radical element of women who really want female priests. And they see the female diaconate as a stepping stone, just like they did in the Anglican Church. And while I used to be in favor of the female diaconate because I could see how they could be an assistance to the priest, the women who are pushing for that today don't want just the diaconate. They want the priesthood. And that will split the church, and we don't want that. So it's better for us not to have women deacons because, I'm sorry, but and I've told them this, they spoiled it. Because we could have women deacons if we knew that we were going to go here and no farther. And they say, yeah, that's all we want, but we know it's not true. We just know it's not true. I'm sorry to say that. Anybody's listening is offended by that. It's the truth. And we know that a couple years ago, they tried to force this on the church by ordaining a woman in Africa who was ordained exactly like a man and serving liturgically. Women deacons did not serve liturgically, but they want that because they want to prove something. But we don't need to prove anything, okay? We have the tradition of the church. We want to preserve that. That's more important than trying to prove that somehow women are capable. So it's really coming from pride and a desire to assert authority or something like that in the church, and that's just not going to fly. Yes, over here.
Oh, yes, sorry. Hi, Dr. Janie. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure.
My question is about how we reconcile. I really appreciate everything that you've said about everything that laywomen can do in the church, and that the admonitions about being in the altar are not really theologically based. I have sons and a daughter.
Yes.
And all of the parishes that I've been to or been around here in Australia have only men serving.
Yes, I know.
Unless they're a monastery. But not just men, also boys.
Yes.
And I can appreciate the value of teaching, young boys
right.
practical skills, reverence, etc., etc. As a mother, though, and watching that oftentimes boys who are present in church every week and have faithful parents are the ones that ends up in there.
Yes.
How do I
Right.
explain to my children if one day my son wants to do that? Do I say no
Daughter?
because it's not fair on my daughter? How do I explain that to her?
I wouldn't do that. Yeah. No, thank you for that question. It's a very good one. There are just a few parishes that have altar girls in America. I'm personally not in favor of that. When I told you that women are allowed to assist, if they have a tonsure and a blessing, they can assist. So what we want to be, but the reason why really this is for boys, and it's better that it stay for boys, is because there are many priests who said that they first felt the calling to the priesthood by serving in the altar. It is, in some respects, considered a sort of a prelude to the priesthood. Now, that doesn't mean, obviously, most boys don't end up becoming priests, but there's something important about that. But there's another reason why we really cannot have girls in the altar. And this is just my opinion. And so you might think, well, she's kind of liberal. This is going to change your mind about that. Women and boys should not, girls are a distraction to boys. Women are a distraction to men. It's just the truth. We shouldn't seek to put women in the altar or girls just to prove something, because the priest is there to perform a sacred function. It's hard enough to concentrate and have the boys concentrating without having a pretty girl next to them. It shouldn't be a place for flirting, okay? What do you say to your daughter? We say that, okay, we say that that this is something that in the tradition of the church, mostly boys do that because boys grow up to be priests. She knows that. And we're going to do other things. And so, I mean, if women teach their girls to be offended by that, that's a problem. That shows that they don't have the phronima, the mentality of the church. We want to teach our girls that we are first and foremost are faithful Orthodox Christians, and we don't change the church to suit ourselves. Now, about the boys, it's very important, and I would that they understand that to serve in the altar is a very sacred thing, and that they have to do this with fear and trembling, and also not think that there's something special about them, because a lot of boys get this idea that they have this privilege just because they're boys. If they're in the altar, it's because Father allows them to serve there, the bishop allows them to serve there, and they should do it with a lot of humility and never think that they're better than girls because they can do that. Okay? So I would make sure that you watch the boys too, because it goes to their head, right? Anybody else? In the back. Yes, sir. I want to give you people let's just have I want to give you your break. We're eating into the break. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sure. No, that's okay. Thanks for coming down to cold, wet Melbourne. Hope the people are treating you better than the weather. Thanks for what you said today. It's quite interesting. I was just wondering if you could reflect or share more on patriarchy. You mentioned that you don't believe the church is patriarchal.
No.
The first thing that comes to my mind, I couldn't help but think about the fact that there are such things or people as patriarchs. So could you comment as to why, I guess how you define
how
patriarchy?
I define it? Patriarchy is an idea that only men are worthy of serving in leadership roles, and that women are somehow supposed to be subservient to them. That's what I understand the patriarchy to mean. You know, we have to be careful not to let these political notions infiltrate the church. In the church, we don't think like the world. We're supposed to think differently than the world. We're supposed to say, I was born a woman, I was given certain talents, and I'm supposed to use them to serve the church. I'm born a man, I have certain talents, and not all men are called to be priests. We're meant to use the talents that God has given us to serve each other and to serve the church. I happen to have always been somebody who likes to sing. I've always sung. And so I like to sing in church. I like to chant. I like to sing in the choir. So that's what I do. And because I have the opportunity to be educated, I'm kind of a big mouth, as you can tell, I ended up doing this. So all of us have talents that are meant to be used in the church. Yes, we have patriarchs because that means father, but it shouldn't be seen as a negative thing. That's what I would say to that. I want to give people a chance to take their break. Is that okay? Is this time for the break? Okay, we're down to like 2 minutes of a break. Well, shall we make it 7 minutes and come back in 7? Is that enough time?
I was going to make it a bit more.
You want to make it a bit more? I thought our session was supposed to start at 2:30.
It is. We'll cope.
You're in charge. Mr. President.